doors here marked life jackets. Inside there are some specially marked for anyone under 75 pounds. Also placards around the boat describing how to put those life jackets on if you feel so inclined to take a look. Due to Coast Guard regulations, there is no open flame in a motor vessel, and therefore there is no smoking or vaping while we're out here. We're going to have you out here for just under 2 hours today. A couple of quick safety rules: absolutely no running on the boat for any reason. If you do go up and down the stairs, which you're welcome to move around, please use the handrails, as we will hit wakes and waves of other boats. We just don't want you to fall. Also, if you brought drinks and snacks or other garments, hats, coats, things like that, please be very cognizant of them. Release them up and just lay them on the deck. Even a half drink, a pop bottle will blow off in the wind. We're going to power up here when we get up closer to the kayak boat dock here, and then I'll talk to you again as we get closer to Grand Island. outfitted with steam hoists. With the aid of early hard hat diving, we're able to slip down underneath the Bermuda lift it just up off the bottom and bring it around under the water into the deep.
Alrighty folks, as Captain John is getting us positioned over the wreck of the Bermuda, I am going to ask if you're able to do so, please slide towards the center of the viewing wells. Once again folks, if you're able to do so, please slide towards the center of the viewing wells. Now before we get started, I do have a few things that I want to mention. If you have a camera, make sure that flash is off, because if the flash is on, you're going to get a selfie instead of a shipwreck. And if you have any questions at any point, don't be afraid to just shout them out. If we don't know the answer, don't worry folks, we'll Google it for you. And I promise, what goes through one viewing well will go through all of the others. So make sure you don't jump wells, I just don't want you to miss anything. If you're in the front viewing wells and you want to sneak peek to what you're going to be seeing, if you look at the back wall on the inside of the cabin, you're going to see a TV that's live streaming footage from our rear viewing well. And a bumpy ride at the bow of the boat and at the stern. Right next to that chain locker are some small circular openings. Those are called hawse eyes. Now those hawse eyes allow ropes and chains to come up from beneath the decking from that chain locker. You're going to start to see a large circular opening in the upper deck. This is called the forward mast hole. Now that mast hole is about 3 feet in diameter, and that's large enough that a scuba diver in full gear can fit through it and dive the lower decks. Now the wreck of the Bermuda is a very popular dive site since it is an intact vessel in such shallow water, which is pretty rare. Most typical Lake Superior shipwrecks are more of a debris field scattered over a large area instead of an intact vessel like this one. Now we're just starting to catch sight of the ship's forward cargo hatch. This is the larger of the 2 cargo hatches on the Bermuda. When the ship went down, she was carrying 488 tons of high-grade iron ore. Well, the ship itself was only rated for about 400 tons. The captain was going on his last trip of the season and had overloaded the ship by 88 tons in favor of a higher payday. That didn't quite work out for him, now did it? Now as we're approaching midship, you're going to start to see a long rectangular opening that runs directly down the middle of the upper deck. This is called the centerboard hatch. Now if you don't know what a centerboard is used to help give a ship stability while in deep water. And right next to that centerboard hatch is some broken up decking along with something that kind of looks like a telephone pole. That's the log boom that the Canadian salvage company had used to help break apart the decking to get light down to their divers. Now when I say divers, I don't mean scuba divers. I mean the divers with the big brass helmets, large canvas suits, and an air hose snaking up to the surface, where hopefully your best buddy was pumping you some fresh air. His name was Captain Michael Finney. At least that's what we think his name was, as he went under a fake name to take control of this vessel, as he had sank another ship prior to this one. Making its way into our rear viewing well is the ship's aft cargo hatch. This is the second largest cargo hatch on the Bermuda. As I mentioned earlier, when the ship went down, she was carrying high-grade iron ore, or specular hematite. This is also nicknamed the Great Lakes Gold, since it costs so much to ship and move around the Great Lakes region. viewing wells, that barrel's actually not with the original shipwreck. Some divers have found it nearby and placed it on the upper deck so we can see it today. Now, we don't actually know what's in that barrel, but I have my thoughts, and I'm sure you all have yours. Now, we're making our way over a very large opening in the upper deck, and this is called the cabin trunk area. Now, the cabin trunk was a 20 by 20 cabin that sat 4 feet below the deck and stuck up 4 feet above it. It held the quarters for the captain, quarters for the first mate, a kitchen, and a bathroom. That large beam that's lying across that cabin trunk area is actually the ship's port side railing. Before the Alger Underwater Preserve was established, some dive boats had anchored to that port side railing. A big gust of wind had came and took the dive boats and the railing right off the shipwreck. They were nice enough to put it back though. As we're making our way towards the stern of the vessel, you're going to see the ship's rudder post sticking up. Now, the rudder of the Bermuda is still intact today. It's just below the curve of the shipwreck where we can't quite see it from the surface. Now we're catching sight of the vessel's stern railing. It only sits about 6 feet below our viewing well's glass. In 2014, it sat about 4 feet higher until we had 7 feet of ice in this bay. The ice had pushed the stern railing down. Now folks, we're going to give you one more drift over top of Bermuda, so if you'd like, you can stay put at the viewing wells. Or, if you want to try your luck, you can go out to the bow and stern on the lower deck and look overboard the Shipwreck Express. You may be able to catch sight of the Bermuda just in plain water since it sits so close to the surface. It'll help if you have polarized sunglasses. Now, when the Canadian Salvage Company was conducting its operations, it was the late 1800s. So it's not exactly like they had underwater flashlights to help them see. So they had to wait until the sun was high in the sky for their work to be visible to them. Which means these hard hat divers could usually only work from about noon until 4 in the afternoon. It took the Canadian Salvage Company an entire summer to offload about 400 tons of the high-grade iron ore that was still left in the hold of the Bermuda. Now today, there's an estimated 88 tons of that ore left down there in the hold. But even if you were to snorkel or scuba dive this wreck, you can't take anything off of it, including that ore. If you take anything off of the shipwreck or deface it in any way, it is a $500 fine plus a few days of jail time. This wreck is protected by the Alger Underwater Preserve, along with many of the other shipwrecks in the area. Actually, because Lake Superior doesn't have zebra or quagga mussels. The water is too cold and the pH is too high to support their life. Bermuda was built in 1860 in Oswego, New York. She had sailed the Great Lakes for 10 short years before meeting her untimely demise.
now going to be approaching the East Chamber Lighthouse Grand Island here in the port side. You see some cabins along here. This is part of that 40 acres that I described earlier of the island that Forest Service doesn't own. No power here. No running water, there's no boats on this side of the island. The only way to get here is pretty much by boat. You see all the dark blue comes in around behind the lighthouse. The current changed here about 25 years ago. It started eroding out the point in front of the lighthouse and around behind it. Got a bunch of volunteers together and drove these cedar poles in an effort to keep it from eroding. The whole lighthouse was going to end up in the water. At one point there, Art's place, the white one, was actually out over the water. We jacked it up and drug it back where it sits today. Done some other work to the lighthouse to keep it restored. They did some cedar siding and cedar shakes. At one point the cupola was actually taken off the top, brought up to Northern Michigan University. Their industrial arts program put it back to its original look. It's entirely made of copper. They replaced the plate glass and redid it. This is pretty much what it would have looked like exactly when it was in operation. It was originally built in 1867. Back then it would have got whitewashed white every spring. It ran until about 1913 till better forms of navigation were put in place. That's the range lights back in town now, sector light, as well as the buoy system. You see an oil lamp up in the top. That is what would have originally lit it, but the oil lamp would have been inside of what's known as a Fresnel lens. And that's a giant glass prism. Some of those on display around the UP, one at the Shipwreck Museum on Whitefish Point, as well as a Coast Guard Museum in Marquette. Inside of the Fresnel lens, the oil lamp would have shined out 14 to 19 miles. It was used to warn sailors of the shoal that used to come out of the water here in front of us, and the fish trap. Used to be some cleared land, there were some outbuildings. They were compensated by the government back then for keeping the oil lamp lit from dusk to dawn. He received $400 a season, 4 quarts of firewood for heating and cooking, and their fringe benefit way back then was a cow. That was for milk for their children. Remember, there was no town of Munising when they were first coming out here. We'll stop one more time, but we're going to stop farther out on our way back. Sand Point. Sand Point is the beginning of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. It starts at Sand Point, runs out. Everything you see there on that starboard side. To the farthest point we can see from here, that's called Indian Head. That's where the Pictured Rocks turn, and they then run due east from there all the way to Grand Marais. They're all small. layer, there's a pinch of rocks layer, miners layer, train layer, and so forth. One of the layers not of a county or rock formation, it's known as the basal-conglomerate. Looks a lot like sand and gravel compressed into a layer of the sandstone rock. Was deposited here by the glaciers thousands of years ago. It's where a lot of the stones come from that people find in the area and the beaches and around that look like they just don't belong. They were in that basal conglomerate, they bust out. The bottom here is all hard sandstone rock. Has been since the lighthouse. It is all the way around the island from here over to the pictured rocks and along is hard rock. There's also some other interesting formations, caves, big and small. There's also a portal up here. The portal is nothing more than a rock arch that goes out over the water. They call it a portal when you can go through one side and out the other. They go through this portal up here with canoes, kayaks, small power boats. And there's lots of these caves and portals all around the pictured rocks and along Grand Island. states about 5 feet deep in water. There's actually enough water in Lake Superior to fill all the other Great Lakes and just about one more Lake Huron. The surface area of Lake Superior is a little bit bigger than the state of South Carolina. Now the next shipwreck we're going to take a look at lies out here in the form of a debris field. That's what most shipwrecks are. That one we saw in Murray's Bay is a very uncommon sight, even in the ocean. Mother Nature doesn't let them stay together in less than 60 feet of water.
Now, funny story about that anchor, it didn't always sit on the lake bed, even after the Hetler had sank. Before the Alger Underwater Preserve was established, a man from Negaunee, Michigan had picked it up off the lake bed, given it a fresh coat of blue paint, and put it in his yard for 30 years as a lawn ornament. Well, then he decided to retire to Florida, and of course FedEx wasn't going to ship a 2,500-pound anchor. So him and Captain B from Shipwreck Tours put it back on the lake bed right where it was before he had taken it. Following the anchor is the vessel's portside section. As Captain John had mentioned earlier, this is what we call a typical Lake Superior shipwreck. It's a debris field style wreck scattered over about a half-a-mile span. Now you're going to see a board that kind of sticks out from the rest of the wood. This is called the rub rail. Now the rub rail was a sacrificial piece of wood used to protect the hull of the ship while it was up against the dock and port. It was easily replaceable as it needed to be replaced quite often. Following that are some openings. Anything circular is a porthole, anything oval is a hawse eye, and anything that kind of has a rectangular shape to it, that's called a scupper. And making its way into our back viewing wells is the Hetler's cargo hoist wheel, used to bring cargo on and off of the ship. The Herman H. Hetler could hold 1,100 tons of cargo, along with 1 million board feet of lumber on her service. Now when the Hetler went down, she was carrying 1,100 tons of salt. Bulk table salt. We like to say that's why our whitefish from this area is so good, because it comes pre-salted. Ooh, tough crowd. Not even a pity chuckle for that one. You're going to start to see some openings in the wood of the wreck. That's that broken up area where the U.S. Coast Guard and Army Corps of Engineers had stuffed the seams of the wreck with dynamite. They'd done that to blow up the wreck as it was sitting up out of the water by about 3 feet. Now you may catch sight of some white spots on the wood of the wreck. That's the lead paint still stuck on the nail heads. As the year the Herman H. Hetler went down, she got a fresh paint job. Now we're going to head over and show you folks the bottom section of the Herman H. Hetler. Something important to know about the ship was that she was considered to be a transitional vessel and was built during a transitional period. This means you have both sailing capabilities and a 485 horsepower steam engine. At the turn of the century, sailors were concerned about the reliability of steam power, so they outfitted the ship with sails just in case something had happened. And here's that bottom section coming into view in our rear viewing wells. Now the Herman H. Hetler was a 210-foot-long, 3-masted wooden schooner until 1926 when she had struck this rock reef. The shipwreck had sat out here for another 3 years until 1929 when it was deemed a navigational hazard, along with a bad omen for sailors coming into the bay. Now there's a lot of miscellaneous debris sitting directly on top of this bottom section. Some chains, some metal piping, even something that kind of looks like railway track. Well, that's because it is railway track. Since the Hetler was 210 feet long, one of the largest wooden vessels sailing on the Great Lakes at the time, she had an internal railway system that was used to help move cargo around the ship. That long square beam that runs directly down the center, that's called the keelson. Anything that runs parallel to the keelson are called the sister keelsons, and anything that runs perpendicular are called the ribs of the ship. Now directly underneath the keelson is a flat board. That's called the keel. Now the keel is considered to be the backbone of every ship, and it's usually the first board laid while constructing a wooden vessel. Now we're gonna head out and show you folks the rock. Yeah, there's been a few of them down there. Oh my. Now this rock reef that we're going over is actually building till it's only going to be about 8 feet below our viewing well glass, before very abruptly dropping down to about 30 to 35 feet of water. A reef like this could be dangerous, even deadly for ships traveling through the area. And here we are making our way off of that rock reef in our from viewing wells now. Now we're at about 30 to 35 feet of water. The farther you are from the reef, the deeper it gets.
Have a light, a little bit more background to it. Fall colors out. It looks more like a lighthouse here from the reef. Right up 10 to and then we're about 20 minutes and we'll go over back to the dock.